Hello, this is a short video about the new QCX-plus, introducing the radio and the reasons behind it, and with a short demonstration QSO at the end. This is the new QCX-plus. This is the QCX transceiver, which was introduced in August 2017. Has been tremendously popular. It was originally designed for the YOTA 2017 summer camp hosted by the RSGB, and in the UK in August 2017. It went on to sell almost 10,000 kits in less than 3 years, which is a really staggering number of kits. It's a simple user interface. You've got the volume control here on the left, audio gain control, rotary encoder here sets the frequency, and two buttons provide a lot of functionality with dual VFOs, split operation. There's a built-in ambit keyer, CW decoder, message memories, frequency memories, built-in test equipment, all kinds of things. The headphones plug in on the left here on this jack socket, and the keyer plugs in on the right-hand side here, the paddle, or you've also got a built-in micro switch which you can use as a straight key here, and the RF is connected here on the right-hand side. At the time, this was developed under severe budgetary constraints as well as time constraints, and that led me to make some compromises. Some of the things that were a problem, if people tried to fit this into enclosure, you had the two connectors on one side here and the other two connectors, the power terminal block here at the back and the audio output, were on the other side, and so it was kind of hard to fit this into an enclosure. Furthermore, if you look at it from the edge on, you can see that all the controls, the LCD and the rotary encoder and the gain control, the buttons, are all at different heights, and that makes it quite hard to fit into an enclosure. But that was a compromise that I lived with because of the time constraints and budget constraints at the time. There was an enclosure produced for the kit by Bamatech, a German company, and they produced some lathe-turned inserts for the buttons and extenders for the gain control and the rotary encoder to get everything at the same height, and they've got the connectors on the two sides here, so that was quite a nice enclosure, and a lot of work went into that to overcome the issues that I mentioned. We have a builder's gallery page on the website, and here you can see a lot of constructors have come up with various different ways to encase their QCX kits, and it really unleashed quite a lot of creativity among the owners of the kits. 3D printed cases, various aluminium enclosures, all kinds of things. I have my own QCX 40 here, which has got a 50 watts power amplifier built into the same enclosure, and that was a aluminium enclosure that I happened to have, and mounted all the boards off all the controls off board. There are other third-party products too, like this nice stand by the North Georgia QRP Club, and yeah, my son unfortunately decided he was going to write his name on it, or try to, but this was a nice way to keep the QCX at a nice operating position. Despite the success of the QCX and the ongoing very strong sales of QCX month by month, it had always bothered me that those shortcomings hadn't been resolved at the design stage, and it was something I always wanted to go back to and resolve. So as a result, this is the new QCX-plus, which resolves a lot of those difficulties. So here is the new QCX-plus 5 watts CW transceiver, available just as the QCX was for 80 meters, 60 meters, 40 meters, 30 meters, 20 meters, or 17 meters. Your single band of choice from any of those 6. This is a prototype of the optional extruded black anodized aluminium enclosure. The front panel here is 55 millimeters high and 106 millimeters wide, and as you can see, there's an additional button on here. This is the power button, and the remainder of the buttons, the two buttons on the QCX and the tuning control and the volume control, will be familiar to any QCX user. The left button here, which is central on the QCX-plus, gets you into the menu structure, so you can go around and you can change whatever you need to in there. During operation, that gives you the speed keyer speed and the RIT setting. The left button is a push switch, locking push switch for power on off. This is only a prototype. There will be some minor changes before the final version, which is currently being manufactured. So one of the things is this power switch will be slightly smaller on the final version, and we're also getting a new rotary, a new gain control manufactured specially with a longer shaft, because this one is quite marginal to be able to get the knob on it. If I just take that off here, you can see that the existing, this is one of the knobs from the existing QCX, and it's not really long enough to be able to protrude far enough to get the knob onto it. So we've commissioned special manufacturing of a custom potentiometer, which has got a few millimeters extra shaft length here. Now if we take a look at the side view, you can see that there are actually now two PCBs in the new QCX-plus. There's a front panel PCB here, which is vertically orientated, and then there's a main rear panel PCB which has got all of the circuits, all of the main circuits on, and we'll have a bit more close look at that in a moment. They slot into the enclosure extremely easily. I'll just remove the unit from the enclosure so you can see how that happens. Take off the knobs. There are 4 screws, one in each corner. So just pop out the screws. I've got 2 mounted on this one, and you can see the front panel just comes off, slides off, leaving inside. Oops, I've pulled off the knob from the power switch here. As you can see, as I mentioned, the power switch cap is actually going to change to a smaller diameter, so this is not quite the right cap for the switch in the prototype. So anyway, you can see inside here we've got the PCB, front panel PCB with the LCD module bolted to it, and the buttons mounted, and the rotary controls mounted here on the right. The controls are all through-hole plated components, as all the QCX components were exactly the same. Now on the rear panel, before we can take this out any further, I'll show you the we've got a 2.1mm connector here, standard barrel connector for power, and we have all of the controls connectors on the rear panel, unlike on the QCX where they're on the 2 sides. So we've got here 4 3.5mm stereo connectors. These 2 additional connectors are for CAT control and for PTT, for controlling the 50 watts power amplifier if you decide you need a little bit more power. This is another kit from QRP Labs, so that's controlled by this connector here. CAT control allows the computer logging program to interface to the QCX and read back the VFO and all the parameters. It includes ability to key the radio to send CW transmissions, to receive the decoded text. Pretty much everything you can do while at the radio itself can also be controlled by a computer. Audio output for earphones and paddle input. The paddle input actually doubles as well as a GPS connection for when you want to use the whisper mode. The serial data 1 pps and ground connections come through on the paddle here. There's a 5 volts output pin on the PDT connector here if you wanted to use a GPS which needed to be powered from the QCX-plus itself. So the only other thing I need to be able to do to get this out of its enclosure is remove the nut from the BNC connector, which I managed to slightly jam there by now. Once I've taken off that nut, you can see the whole thing just slides out of the enclosure. So it's basically there are some rails here on the side of the enclosure. You can see here this is a really sturdy enclosure. The walls of the enclosure here are 4mm thick aluminium, and the bottom and top piece is a 2.5mm aluminium. So you can see again here it just should slide through. and just slots through nicely into the back there. And then you can just do up the screws, put the front panel on, and that's all there is to it. Now here's a comparison of the QCX next to the QCX-plus and at the bottom of the picture, and this really shows you the difference in size between the two, and this is one of the main differences between the QCX and the QCX-plus. The main board of the QCX-plus is 13 centimeters by 10 centimeters, whereas the QCX was 10 centimeters by 8 centimeters. When you take into account that a lot of the controls and the LCD are moved to the front panel as well, in the area of the front panel, the actual PCB area in the QCX-plus is 2.2 times what it was in the QCX. And that allows us to have a lot lower component density. So the components are a lot more spread out, and that makes it easier to construct. Now a closer look at the main board, and you can really see what I mean about the components being spread out. All of the resistors are now lying down horizontally on the board, and there's quite a lot of space in between the various sections of the radio. The general signal flow is from the antenna here and comes through the power amplifier, the transmit receive switch here, bandpass filter, through the receive mixer, the SI5351A frequency synthesizer is here, and the microcontroller of course controls everything. That's put as close as possible to the display module and the front panel module so that you get minimum amount of digital wiring between the two that could radiate into the receiver. The IQ channel preamplifier IC5 is here, and from there the signal flows through the phase shift circuits and the CW filter and the final audio amplifier here. And so you can see it's quite a logical arrangement in this kind of path through around in a sort of U shape here to the output here. Some specific things to mention: one of the changes here to the power amplifier, the 3 power amplifier transistors, 3 BS170 MOSFETs, and the MPS751 RF envelope keying shaping circuit transistor, the MPS751, are now bolted with their flats against the PCB with this large washer here in the bolt, and that's using the PCB as a heatsink. So hopefully that should avoid overheating of these transistors a little bit more often, at least make it harder. The 7805 voltage regulator does get quite warm, particularly if you use more than 12 volts, and that's now right here at the back, so it can bolt onto the enclosure, and the enclosure has a hole drilled in the right place for that to happen. Between the two boards here you've got these right-angled 2-row pin headers on the main PCB and corresponding sockets on the front panel, and those carry all the signals to the LCD, the buttons, and the rotary controls there on the front panel. This is just a prototype, and I got the dimensions, the positioning of those connectors slightly wrong in the prototype, so I had to bend the wires by 2 millimeters to make them fit. Bad calculation on my part. So here I am, I'm running firmware version 1.04, so slightly out of date here. The firmware is the same as the QCX firmware, totally forwardly and backwardly compatible. In the QCX, all the PCB revisions as well as the QCX-plus all work with the same firmware and are interchangeable. The other thing I've done is use a lot of pads. You can see there are pin header pads here by the rear connectors, and that allows you to reconfigure those rear connectors if you want to. And there are similar pairs of pads all over the place at the entrance to the CW filter and the output of the CW filter, at the IQ outputs here. There are test points at all the SI5351A outputs, as well as the frequency counter input here. The DVM and RF power inputs over here now have a 12-volt pin as well, so it's quite easy to jump across to the DVM if you want to read the battery voltage. And those are not now right next to the in-circuit programmer, so you can't quite so easily short-circuit them to that as some people did on the QCX. There are 4 mounting holes here in the corner. The intention for those is that you could bolt another board on top to hold batteries or modifications, all kinds of other things that you could imagine. The enclosure is actually large enough to fit the 50 watts power amplifier kit inside it as well, but then you'd need to make some arrangements for holes in the rear panel to access the B and C connectors, or you'd have to wire those B and C connections directly into the QCX-plus CW transceiver here, but that's an option too. A few other circuit modifications. The circuit is almost identical to the QCX. The only modifications that there are is this capacitor here, C24, has been increased to 470 microfarads. That increases the that reduces the transmit receive click that you hear on changeover. There's an extra resistor here from pin 13 to pin 14 of the IC3. That just is a modification that makes the PTT work better at power up when using the 50 watts power amplifier. And there's an additional decoupling capacitor here. Back to the enclosure, the rear panel here, the changes to the final version are, which is being manufactured now, that the text, this is laser etched white text, is being reduced so that it's all the same height over each of the connectors, the same height, so the distance between the RF here and the hole will be the same on all of them. The other change is that you can see here the silvery raw aluminium in the cut. That's again just because it was a rapidly produced sample. In the final manufacturing run, the anodizing process is done after the cutting and drilling, and therefore the insides of the holes are also the black color rather than the raw aluminium. On the front panel, upon seeing the sample here, I felt that the text was rather smaller than I had anticipated, so I've requested that the QRP Labs logo and transceiver name here, as well as the text on the buttons and the rotary encoder control here, is all going to be increased by 25%. So now I'm going to try and give a demonstration QSO with the new QCX-plus. And I'm just going to be using the shack loudspeakers, so you'll hear the air conditioning in the background and various other noise here in the background. Not great sound quality, but it will give you an idea of how things go. So I've just switched straight on, and I hear an Italian calling CQ on 14.020, which is the default frequency on the QCX, unless you've stored any parameters. Let's see if he can answer. So there we are, the QCX-plus. QCX-plus is currently in production. It will be shipping around mid-June 2020, and you can make your pre-purchases on the QRP Labs shop. The QCX-plus is priced at $55 and the enclosure kit is priced at $25. The links are down below. Thank you very much for watching. 73.